Two 14-year-old twin girls stood side by side in the church choir loft on what would be their final Sunday morning, their voices about to create harmony one last time before vanishing forever into the Georgia pines. Sarah and Ruth Caldwell didn't know that October 14, 1962, would mark the end of everything their family had built in the small town of Millbrook, where Baptist hymns echoed through tree-lined streets and children still walked home alone without fear. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews of Millbrook Baptist Church. Helen Caldwell adjusted her hat and smoothed her dress as she watched her daughters from the front row, their identical faces glowing with the pure joy that came from singing together. James Caldwell, the town's most respected insurance agent, straightened his tie and nodded approvingly as the choir director raised his baton. "How great thou art," began with the gentle hum of voices, but when Sarah and Ruth's soprano harmonies soared above the congregation, something magical happened. Their voices wove together like golden threads, each note perfectly complementing the other, in a way that only twins seemed capable of achieving. Mrs. Patterson in the third pew dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. Old Mr. Jenkins, who rarely showed emotion, found himself smiling despite the arthritis pain in his knuckles. The twins had been singing together since they could barely speak, their voices naturally finding each other across any room. Ruth, born 7 minutes before Sarah, usually took the lead melody, while Sarah instinctively found the harmony that made their duets sound like angels had descended into the little church. Their mother often joked that God had split one perfect voice between two perfect daughters. Pastor Morris concluded his sermon about walking in faith, his words carrying extra weight as he watched the Caldwell family in their usual front pew. The twins sat perfectly still, their matching blue dresses pressed and proper, their dark hair braided identically by their mother's careful hands that very morning. They represented everything good about Millbrook: innocence, tradition, and the kind of small-town values that made neighbors feel like family. As the service ended and the congregation began filing out into the crisp autumn air, Sarah whispered to Ruth about the afternoon plans they'd made. A simple walk home through downtown, maybe stopping at Peterson's Five and Dime to look at the new fall decorations. Such ordinary plans for an extraordinary Sunday that would shatter their families' world forever. The church bells chimed 11 times as the Caldwell twins stepped into the Georgia sunshine, completely unaware that they were walking toward a mystery that would haunt Millbrook for 60 years. The walk from Millbrook Baptist Church to the Caldwell home on Maple Street covered exactly 8 blocks through the heart of downtown, a route the twins had traveled hundreds of times since they were old enough to walk without holding their mother's hand. Every Sunday after service, Sarah and Ruth would skip down the church steps, wave goodbye to their parents who stayed behind for the adult fellowship hour, and make their way home through streets where everyone knew their names. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins was watering her prize-winning roses when she spotted the girls at 11:47 a.m., their blue dresses bright against the autumn foliage. "Beautiful singing today, girls," she called out, and Ruth waved back with her usual sunny smile while Sarah stopped to admire the late-blooming flowers. Mrs. Hutchins would later tell investigators that both girls seemed perfectly normal, chattering about something that made them giggle as they continued down Oak Avenue. 3 blocks later, at the corner of Oak and Main, 12-year-old Bobby Henderson was throwing a baseball against his garage door when the twins passed by. He remembered Sarah mentioning something about stopping at Peterson's Five and Dime to look at Halloween decorations, though Ruth seemed more interested in getting home to help their mother with Sunday dinner preparations. The church bells had just finished chiming noon when Bobby last saw them disappearing around the corner toward downtown. Peterson's Five and Dime sat at the busiest intersection in Millbrook, where Main Street crossed Railroad Avenue. Store owner Jack Peterson was arranging a display of autumn leaves and miniature pumpkins when he noticed the time on his wall clock, 12:15 p.m. The twins should have passed by his store window by now if they were heading straight home, but he couldn't recall seeing their distinctive matching outfits among the few Sunday shoppers browsing his sidewalk displays. By 12:30, Helen Caldwell was setting the dining room table for 4, expecting to hear the familiar sound of the front door opening and her daughter's voices calling out their arrival. The pot roast filled the house with the rich aroma that usually brought the girls running to the kitchen, eager to steal tastes before dinner was served. At 1 p.m., Helen walked to the front porch and looked down Maple Street, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. The tree-lined avenue stretched empty in both directions, with only the gentle rustle of falling leaves disturbing the Sunday quiet. By 1:30, she was walking the route herself, her heart beginning to pound with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of hurrying through downtown Millbrook, calling her daughters' names into the growing silence. The telephone in the Caldwell kitchen rang at exactly 2:17 p.m., its shrill tone cutting through the Sunday afternoon quiet. Like a blade, Helen's hand trembled as she lifted the receiver, hoping beyond hope to hear Sarah's voice explaining why they were late, or Ruth apologizing for losing track of time at Peterson's store. "Helen?" Pastor Morris's concerned voice came through the line. "James is still here at the church helping with the fellowship cleanup. He mentioned the girls were supposed to be home by now. Is everything all right?" The question Helen had been trying not to ask herself suddenly hung in the air between them. Everything was not all right. Her daughters, who had never been more than 15 minutes late in their entire lives, had been missing for over 2 hours. The pot roast had long since cooled, the dining room table still set for 4 people who would never sit down to eat together again. "Pastor, I need James to come home right now," Helen said, her voice barely steady. "Something's happened to my girls." Within 20 minutes, James Caldwell was racing through the front door, still wearing his Sunday suit, but with his tie loosened, and his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. Behind him came Pastor Morris and 3 deacons from the church, their faces grave with the understanding that this wasn't a case of children simply losing track of time. "I've walked their entire route twice," Helen said, pacing the living room, like a caged animal. "I talked to Mrs. Hutchins, to the Henderson boy, to everyone who might have seen them. Nobody's seen hide nor hair of them since Bobby Henderson spotted them heading toward downtown." James picked up the telephone directory, with hands that shook slightly. "I'm calling Sheriff Bradley. This isn't like them. Sarah and Ruth would never just disappear without telling us where they were going." The first official search began at 3:30 p.m. when Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived at the Caldwell home with 2 deputies. By 4 p.m., word had spread through the congregation, and volunteers were gathering at the church to organize search parties. The same sanctuary where Sarah and Ruth had sung their final duet that morning now buzzed with urgent whispers and the rustling of hastily assembled search teams. Mrs. Patterson brought coffee and thermoses. Mr. Jenkins, despite his arthritis, insisted on joining the group, searching the woods behind the railroad tracks. Even teenagers who barely knew the twins showed up with flashlights and determination. As the sun began to set over Millbrook, casting long shadows across the town where children had always been safe, the terrible truth was beginning to settle. In the pit of every parent's stomach, Sarah and Ruth Caldwell hadn't just wandered off. Something had taken Millbrook's angels away. The correction came like a whispered prayer that changed everything. James Caldwell wasn't just the town's insurance agent. He was Pastor James Caldwell, shepherd to 300 souls at Millbrook Baptist Church. And Sarah and Ruth weren't just missing children. They were the preacher's daughters who had vanished, without a trace. Monday morning brought reporters from Atlanta, their cameras clicking as they captured shots of the white clapboard church where Pastor Caldwell had delivered sermons about faith and protection for over a decade. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had counseled countless families through their darkest hours now faced his own valley of shadows, and the entire community watched to see if his faith would survive the test. "Pastor, how do you reconcile this tragedy with your belief in God's plan?" asked a young reporter with hungry eyes, shoving a microphone toward James as he tried to enter his own church for the emergency prayer meeting. Helen Caldwell stood beside her husband, her face pale but composed, drawing strength from 20 years of being a minister's wife. She had perfected the art of public grace under pressure, but the dark circles under her eyes betrayed the sleepless nights and private anguish that no congregation would ever witness. "We believe God is with us in this trial," James said quietly, his voice carrying the same steady authority that had comforted his flock through births, deaths, and everything in between. We ask for your prayers and respect for our families, privacy as we search for our daughters. But privacy was a luxury the Caldwell family could no longer afford. Deacon William Hayes pulled James aside after the prayer meeting, his weathered face creased with concern. "Pastor, there's talk in town. Some folks are wondering if maybe someone targeted the girls specifically because they're your daughters. You know how prominent our family is in the community." The weight of that possibility settled on James's shoulders like a lead blanket. Every sermon he had preached against sin, every stand he had taken on moral issues, every person he had refused communion to, any of it could have made enemies. The thought that his daughters might have paid the price for his ministry was almost too much to bear. That evening, as Helen prepared another untouched dinner for 2 instead of 4, she found her husband kneeling in their bedroom, not in the practiced posture of pastoral prayer, but collapsed in raw anguish. "What if I brought this on them?" he whispered into his hands. "What if being the preacher's daughters made them targets?" Outside their window, Millbrook settled into another restless night, while somewhere in the darkness, the answers to their prayers remained hidden, waiting to surface 60 years later behind sacred walls. The bloodhounds arrived at dawn on Tuesday, their powerful noses pressed to the ground as they worked the scent trail from the last confirmed sighting near Peterson's 5 and Dime. Sheriff Tom Bradley watched the German shepherds strain against their leads, following an invisible path that only they could detect through downtown Millbrook's quiet streets. "Dogs are picking up something strong," called out handler Jim Morrison, his voice cutting through the October morning mist. Trails leading toward the railroad tracks, then into the pine woods beyond Miller's Creek. 200 volunteers had assembled at the church parking lot by 6 a.m., their breath visible in the cold air as they clutched coffee cups and waited for search assignments. Housewives stood next to mill workers, teenagers next to grandparents, all united by the desperate need to bring Sarah and Ruth Caldwell home. The scope of the search had expanded beyond anything Millbrook had ever seen. 3 counties, state police and now FBI agents in dark suits, who spoke in hushed tones about jurisdictional protocols. Agent Robert Hartwell spread topographical maps across the hood of his government sedan, marking search grids with red pencil. "We need to cover every abandoned building, every hunting cabin, every possible hiding place within a 50-mile radius," he told Sheriff Bradley. These girls didn't just vanish into thin air, but as the hours stretched into days, that's exactly what seemed to have happened. The bloodhounds lost the scent at Miller's Creek, their tracking suddenly ending at the water's edge, as if the twins had simply evaporated. Divers searched the creek bed, while volunteer searchers combed through dense underbrush that tore at their clothes and scratched their faces. They found nothing, no footprints, no torn fabric, no sign that Sarah and Ruth had ever passed through those woods. Pastor Caldwell joined every search party, his clerical collar replaced by work clothes as he pushed through brambles and called his daughters' names until his voice was hoarse. Helen maintained a vigil at the church, coordinating food for the searchers and fielding phone calls from concerned strangers as far away as California who had heard about the missing twins on the national news. By Friday, the initial surge of hope was giving way to something darker. FBI agent Hartwell pulled Sheriff Bradley aside after another fruitless day in the woods. "Sheriff, we need to start considering that this might not be a search and rescue operation anymore. After 5 days with no contact, no ransom demands, and no physical evidence." His words hung in the autumn air like a death sentence, unspoken but understood. The prayers echoing from Millbrook Baptist Church were changing too, shifting from pleas for safe return to desperate bargains with God, as a small Georgia town began to confront the possibility that their angels were never coming home. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, 73-year-old Martha Finch, who had been organizing church records in the basement archives when FBI agent Hartwell asked to review the visitor log from October 14th. Her arthritic fingers traced the entries until she stopped at one particular signature, her face growing pale. "I remember him now," she whispered, her voice trembling. "A stranger, maybe 40 years old, sitting alone in the back pew during service. Had dark hair, wore a brown jacket that looked too warm for the weather. He kept staring at the choir loft the whole time, barely looked at Pastor Caldwell during the sermon." Agent Hartwell leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Tell me everything you remember about this man. Martha closed her eyes, concentrating. He signed the visitor book as David Miller from Columbus, but something felt wrong about him. The way he watched those girls when they sang, it wasn't normal appreciation for beautiful music. It was intense. Made my skin crawl, if I'm being honest. Within hours, the visitor log entry became the focus of the entire investigation. The signature was analyzed by handwriting experts, the name traced through records in Columbus and surrounding cities. No David Miller matching the description could be found anywhere in Georgia, Alabama, or Florida. The man had used a false identity, confirming everyone's worst fears about his intentions. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, who had seen the twins walking past her rose garden, suddenly remembered something that made her blood run cold. For there was a car parked on Oak Avenue that morning, a dark sedan I'd never seen before. Engine was running like someone was waiting for something. I thought it was odd at the time, but didn't pay much attention. The pieces began forming a terrifying picture. A stranger had attended church specifically to watch Sarah and Ruth sing. He had used a false name, positioned himself to observe their every movement, and possibly followed them on their walk home. The FBI composite artist worked with Martha Finch and 2 other congregation members who remembered seeing the mysterious visitor, creating a sketch of a man with hollow eyes and a predatory stare. Sheriff Bradley distributed the composite throughout the Southeast, and tips began pouring in from across 3 states. A similar-looking man had been spotted near schools in Alabama. Another sighting placed him at a church social in Tennessee just weeks before the twins disappeared. Each lead seemed to confirm what investigators now believed. A calculating predator had targeted the Caldwell girls, studied their routines, and struck with methodical precision. For the first time since the disappearance, the community felt they had something concrete to grasp, an enemy with a face, a suspect with a pattern. But hope can be more dangerous than despair when it's built on shadows and assumptions, and the stranger in the back pew would lead them down a path that obscured the truth for 60 years. The whispers started at the Wednesday evening prayer meeting, spreading through the congregation like poison in a well. Millbrook Baptist Church, once a sanctuary of unity and faith, had become a breeding ground for suspicion and doubt that would tear the community apart from within. "I heard that stranger wasn't the only one acting peculiar that Sunday," murmured Betty Morrison to her sewing circle, her voice low but carrying just far enough to be overheard. "My cousin works at the sheriff's office, and she says they're looking at people closer to home now." At Palmer's Diner on Main Street, conversations stopped when certain people entered. Coffee grew cold as neighbors who had known each other for decades suddenly found themselves studying familiar faces with new eyes. Tom Henderson, whose son Bobby had been one of the last to see the twins, noticed how other parents pulled their children closer when he walked by, as if tragedy might be contagious. The church social hall, where just 2 weeks earlier the congregation had celebrated Pastor Caldwell's 10th anniversary, now felt like a courtroom where everyone was both judge and potential defendant. Deacon William Hayes found himself defending his own character after someone mentioned he had been working late at the hardware store the Sunday the girls disappeared. "It's natural for people to be scared," Helen Caldwell told her husband as they sat in their kitchen, the untouched dinner plate still set for 4, becoming a nightly reminder of their loss. "But I never thought they'd turn on each other like this." Pastor Caldwell's sermons began to take on a different tone, pleading for unity while his congregation fractured before his eyes. The same people who had organized search parties now avoided eye contact in the pews. The choir director, Martin Kellner, resigned after whispers about his unusual attention to the young singers, though no one could point to anything specific he had done wrong. Parents stopped letting their children walk alone anywhere in Millbrook. The simple trust that had allowed Sarah and Ruth to stroll home from church became unthinkable as fear transformed neighbors into potential threats. Sunday. School attendance dropped as families worried about leaving their children with teachers they had trusted for years. The Caldwell family found themselves increasingly isolated, their grief compounded by the community's growing paranoia. Former friends crossed the street to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Phone calls that once brought comfort now brought accusations disguised as concern. "Maybe God is testing our faith through this trial," James said during one particularly painful Sunday service, his voice breaking slightly as he looked out at the half-empty pews. But even he was beginning to wonder if some tests were simply too much for any community to bear. The stranger in the back pew had done more than take two little girls. He had shattered the very foundation of trust that held Millbrook together, leaving behind a town where everyone was a suspect and no one felt safe. The first letter arrived 3 weeks after the disappearance, postmarked from Birmingham with no return address. Helen Caldwell's hands shook as she tore open the envelope, hope and dread warring in her chest as she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. Your daughters are safe with me. They sing hymns every night before bed. Send $5,000 to General Delivery, Montgomery, Alabama, and you'll see them again." Helen collapsed into her kitchen chair, the letter fluttering to the linoleum floor as she reached for the telephone with trembling fingers. Within an hour, FBI agents were in her living room, examining the letter with magnifying glasses and chemical tests, their faces grim with the knowledge that came from handling too many similar cases. "Mrs. Caldwell, we see this pattern in high-profile missing children cases," Agent Hartwell explained gently. "Sick individuals who prey on desperate families. We'll follow every lead, but I need you to prepare yourself for disappointment." But Helen Caldwell was past the point of rational preparation. When you're drowning, you grab at anything that floats, even if it's made of lies. The FBI set up monitoring equipment in the Caldwell home, recording every phone call, intercepting every piece of mail that might bring word of Sarah and Ruth. Over the next 6 months, 17 more letters arrived from various cities across the South. Each claimed to have the girls, each demanded money or specific actions. Each sent Helen's heart soaring with hope before crashing back to earth when the FBI investigations revealed elaborate hoaxes perpetrated by strangers who had read about the case in newspapers. The cruelest letter came just before Christmas, written in childish handwriting that mimicked what a 14-year-old girl might produce. "Mama, we are okay but scared. The man says if you put money in the old oak tree behind the church, he will let us come home for Christmas. We love you, Sarah and Ruth." Helen insisted on placing the requested money despite Agent Hartwell's protests. She spent Christmas Eve, crouched behind headstones in the church cemetery, watching the oak tree through binoculars, praying to see her daughters emerge from the darkness. No one came. The money sat untouched until dawn. Postmaster Roy Clemens began recognizing Helen's footsteps on the post office steps, the desperate rhythm of a mother checking for mail multiple times each day. "Nothing today, Mrs. Caldwell," became his most frequent words, delivered with the gentle sympathy of a man who had watched hope slowly die in a woman's eyes. As 1963 turned into 1964, the letters became less frequent, but Helen never stopped, believing that the next envelope might contain the miracle she needed. Each false promise carved another piece from her heart, yet she clung to the possibility that somewhere, somehow, her daughters were still alive and waiting to come home. The mailbox at 412 Maple Street became both altar and torture device, holding the prayers and nightmares of a mother who refused to surrender hope. Detective Lisa Morrison discovered the Caldwell case file on a sweltering August morning in 2022, buried beneath 60 years of dust and bureaucratic neglect in the basement. Archives of the county courthouse. The manila folder had grown thick with reports, witness statements, and faded photographs. But what struck her most was how abruptly the documentation ended, as if the entire investigation had simply been abandoned when leads ran cold. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation had recently launched a cold case initiative, using modern forensic techniques to revisit unsolved crimes from decades past. Morrison, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for tenacity, had volunteered for the assignment, despite warnings from colleagues that cold cases were career dead ends, where old mysteries went to die. 2 14-year-old twins vanish without a trace in 1962, she muttered, spreading the crime scene photographs across her desk. No bodies, no ransom demands that panned out, no credible suspects, just gone. Her first stop was the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, where Captain Derek Hayes, grandson of the original investigating officer, pulled the remaining evidence boxes from deep storage. The contents were heartbreaking. Sarah and Ruth's school photographs, their shared Bible with pressed flowers marking favorite verses, and hundreds of letters from psychics, con artists, and well-meaning strangers who claimed to have information about the girls. "My grandfather worked this case until the day he retired," Captain Hayes said, his voice heavy with inherited frustration. "It broke him, really. He never could let it go. Always felt like he'd failed those girls and their family." Morrison's next interview was with Bobby Henderson, now 72 and living in Atlanta, who still remembered being 12 years old and throwing a baseball against his garage door when the Caldwell twins walked past for the final time. His eyes misted as he recalled their laughter, the way Sarah had admired his mother's roses, how normal everything had seemed on that October afternoon. "I've thought about them every Sunday for 60 years, Bobby said quietly. Wondered what happened to those sweet girls, whether they suffered, whether someone out there knows the truth and just never came forward. The case had been officially reclassified as a homicide in 1965, though no bodies had ever been recovered. The original investigators had pursued hundreds of leads, interviewed dozens of suspects, and chased the mysterious stranger from the back pew across 3 states, but every trail had eventually gone cold. As Morrison reviewed the witness statements and evidence logs, she began to see patterns that earlier investigators might have missed. Modern investigative techniques, DNA analysis, digital records, enhanced fingerprint processing, offered tools that simply hadn't existed in 1962. Something had been overlooked. After 6 decades of silence, the Caldwell twins were calling out for justice from beyond the grave, and Detective Lisa Morrison was finally ready to listen. The discovery came during routine renovation of Millbrook Baptist Church's baptismal area, when construction worker Dale Martinez's sledgehammer broke through what should have been solid concrete behind the pool. His flashlight beam revealed a hollow space, and wedged deep within the cavity was a leather-bound Bible, its pages yellowed with age but still intact after 60 years of hiding. Detective Morrison arrived within an hour, her heart racing as she carefully extracted the book with gloved hands. The inscription on the first page made her blood run cold. "To our beloved daughters Sarah and Ruth, may God's word guide your voices in harmony forever. Love, Mama and Daddy, Christmas 1961. The twins' shared Bible, the one Helen Caldwell had, mentioned in her original missing persons report, the one that had vanished along with her daughters. But how had it ended up sealed behind the baptismal pool, and who had hidden it there? Morrison's investigation led her to Shady Oaks Nursing Home, where 89-year-old Martin Kellner spent his days staring out windows with eyes that had seen too much. The former choir director had been confined to a wheelchair for 3 years, his mind drifting between past and present, like smoke in the wind. "Mr. Kellner," Morrison said gently, placing the Bible on the table before him. "Do you remember this book?" The old man's trembling hands touched the leather cover, and suddenly his clouded eyes became sharp with recognition and terror. "Oh, God," he whispered, his voice cracking with 60 years of buried guilt. "You found it. I prayed it would stay hidden forever." The confession came in broken fragments, delivered between tears and long silences as Martin Kellner finally unburdened himself of the secret that had consumed his soul. He told Morrison about the Sunday afternoon when Sarah and Ruth had returned to the church to retrieve their forgotten Bible, finding him alone in the choir loft where he had been struggling with desires he couldn't control. "They trusted me," he sobbed, his words barely audible. "They called me Mr. Martin, always so polite, so innocent. When they walked in and saw me with those photographs I kept hidden, they were going to tell their father. I couldn't let them destroy my life." The horror of what followed spilled out in agonizing detail, how he had panicked, how the confrontation had escalated beyond his control, how 2 beautiful voices had been silenced forever in the place where they had once lifted hearts toward heaven. He described burying their bodies in the woods behind Miller's Creek, the same area where bloodhounds had lost the scent decades earlier. "I put their Bible behind the baptismal pool because I couldn't bear to bury it with them," Kellner whispered, It seemed too sacred to put in the ground. I thought if I kept it safe, maybe God would forgive me someday. Detective Morrison sat in stunned silence as the truth finally emerged after 6 decades of lies. The stranger in the back pew had been a red herring. The real monster had been hiding in plain sight, directing the choir, leading the search parties, comforting the grieving family while carrying the darkest secret in Millbrook's history. The full scope of Martin Kellner's deception became clear as Detective Morrison spent the following days reviewing his confession with surviving church members who remembered the aftermath of the twins' disappearance. The man who had resigned from his choir director position amid whispered suspicions had actually orchestrated one of the most elaborate cover-ups in Georgia criminal history. He was the one who suggested we focus on the stranger in the back pew, recalled 85-year-old Martha Finch, her voice shaking with the realization of how thoroughly they had all been manipulated. Martin came to me after that first prayer meeting and said he remembered seeing a suspicious man during the service. He helped me remember details that weren't real. The visitor log entry, the composite sketch, even the reports of a dark sedan on Oak Avenue, all had been carefully planted suggestions by Kellner to redirect the investigation away from himself. He had attended every search party, comforted the grieving parents, and led memorial services, while the bodies of Sarah and Ruth lay buried in the woods he had helped search. The cruelest part, Morrison told her supervisor, as she prepared the arrest warrant, is that he convinced an entire community to turn against each other. Neighbors who had trusted each other for decades became suspicious strangers because of his lies. At Shady Oaks nursing home, Kellner continued his confession with the mechanical precision of a man finally unburdening himself of a lifetime's worth of guilt. He described the exact location where he had buried the twins, how he had used his knowledge of the church's construction to hide their Bible, and the decades of nightmares that had haunted him every time he heard children singing hymns. "I tried to kill myself 3 times, he whispered to Morrison during their final interview, but I think God kept me alive so I could finally tell the truth. Those girls deserved better than a secret grave in the woods." The forensic team found Sarah and Ruth Caldwell's remains exactly where Kellner had described, their small skeletons still clothed in the blue dresses they had worn to church on that final Sunday morning. The medical examiner confirmed what the confession had revealed. The twins had died from blunt force trauma. Their lives ended in moments of panic and violence that had shattered Millbrook's innocence forever. As news of Kellner's arrest spread through the community, the reaction was not relief but a deeper kind of horror. The monster they had feared for 60 years hadn't been a stranger lurking in shadows. He had been standing right beside them in the choir loft, directing their voices in harmony while keeping the darkest discord locked in his heart. The truth had finally surfaced, but its revelation brought not peace but the devastating knowledge that evil can wear the most trusted faces and hide behind the most sacred duties. The funeral for Sarah and Ruth Caldwell took place on a crisp October morning in 2022, exactly 60 years and 2 weeks after their disappearance. Millbrook Baptist Church overflowed with mourners who had waited 6 decades to say goodbye to the twins, whose voices had once filled the sanctuary with heavenly harmony. Helen Caldwell had died in 1998. Her mailbox vigil finally ended, but her questions unanswered. Pastor James Caldwell had followed her in 2003, his faith tested but never broken, still believing somewhere in his heart that truth would eventually surface. They were buried together in Millbrook Cemetery, their shared headstone bearing the inscription, "Beloved parents of Sarah and Ruth, reunited in God's eternal choir." Detective Morrison stood at the back of the church as the current pastor delivered the eulogy, watching the faces of elderly congregation members who were finally able to process 60 years of misdirected grief and suspicion. Betty Morrison, now 91 and confined to a wheelchair, wept openly as she remembered how the community had turned against itself in fear and paranoia. "We were so afraid of the stranger among us," she whispered to her daughter. "We never saw the wolf shepherding our flock." Martin Kellner died in the county jail 3 days before the trial, his 90-year-old heart finally giving out under the weight of confession and consequence. His death cheated the legal system of formal justice, but brought a different kind of closure to the families and friends who had lived with questions for most of their lives. The cemetery service was smaller, more intimate as Sarah and Ruth were, finally laid to rest beside their parents. Their shared headstone bore a simple inscription chosen by their surviving cousin. Sarah and Ruth Caldwell, beloved daughters, age 14, voices silenced but never forgotten. Detective Morrison placed the twins' recovered Bible on the fresh grave, its leather cover worn but still intact after its long imprisonment behind sacred walls. Inside the front cover, someone had added a new inscription below their parents. Christmas message. Truth revealed October 2022. Justice served. Peace restored. As the mourners dispersed and Millbrook began the long process of healing from its deepest wound, children's voices could be heard from the church playground next door, a new generation singing songs of joy and innocence, unaware of the darkness that had once lurked so close to their light. The Harmony girls had finally come home, their story complete, their truth revealed. In death they had accomplished what their disappearance in life could not. They had restored faith, revealed truth, and reminded a community that justice, however delayed, eventually finds its voice. The choir loft at Millbrook Baptist Church stands empty now, awaiting new voices to fill the silence that has lingered too long.